My name is Thomas Hale. I am 49 years old. I served 17 years in the Washington State Coast Guard, and for the last 16, I have hidden a child of the ocean in my home. I did not find him out of compassion. I found him after firing into the fog at something I believed was a threat near a smuggler's boat. The next morning, the sea left its wounded young on the shore. And for the last 3 nights, the adults have come back for him. And for me. They finally found me. Today. I'm recording this because last night I found a flattened bullet lying on the wet boards of my back porch. A .40 caliber round, warped by salt and stone. There were no footprints, no mud, just the bullet and the smell of high tide. Noah saw it before I did. He went still in the water, staring at me as if he had finally understood something I had kept buried for far too long. Noah is the name I gave him. I don't know what his own kind call him. I named him when he could still fit between my forearms and slept in a tub full of saltwater and ice. Back then I thought the important thing was keeping him alive and hidden. Later I understood that for me, the important thing was refusing to admit whose blood the sea had mixed into the foam the night before. Before that, I was a procedural man, divorced, no children. I lived and still live in an old house near Westport with a damp basement. In the service, people respected me because I didn't lose my head on night operations. In 2009, I was still in uniform. That fall brought us weeks of low fog and moonless nights. There was a small smuggling route north of Gray's Harbor, stolen fuel, pills, tobacco, sometimes guns, sometimes people. The operation happened on October 14th. We got a report of an unlit vessel moving near a tongue of rock where nobody ran that tide. 4 of us went out. I was at the stern with a flashlight, a radio, and my service weapon. The water was black, and the fog threw the light right back in our faces. We saw the boat before we heard it, low silhouette, hugging the rocks. Our coxswain called for identification. Nobody answered. A second later, we saw movement on board, then a flash, then shouting. One of the men tried to shove something over the side. At the time, I thought it was cargo. For years, I wished I had been right. We moved in closer than recommended because the current was shifting, and if we waited for backup, the boat could vanish into the rocks. I swept my light to starboard and saw 2 things at once. The first was a human hand gripping the gunwale. The second was not human. It was a large figure clinging to the side, half out of the water, its wet back shining under the beam, strength in its arms that did not fit anything I had ever seen climbing onto a boat in open water. Someone on the boat shouted that there was a weapon. Another shouted that something was coming up. I raised my pistol because that was what I had been trained to do. Unknown figure, large, fast, almost no visibility, panicked men, close range. I wasn't thinking about monsters. I was thinking about survival. I was thinking about my team. I was thinking about making it home. The flashlight caught a face for only an instant, not long enough to understand it, but long enough to know it belonged to nothing I could name. Eyes too far apart, pale, smooth skin under a sheen of water, mouth open not in threat, but in effort. Then I saw something else. A net snagged along the side of the boat, pulled tight toward the water as if there were living weight on the other end. I fired once. The shot cracked through the fog, and the sea answered with a scream that did not sound human. It was not the sound of an injured man. It was worse. It sounded like something very old discovering, far too late, that we knew how to kill too. After the shot, everything got worse, not clearer. The figure let go of the side of the boat and disappeared into the water with a heavy impact. Not the way a man falls, but the way something made to live below does. The net hanging over the edge thrashed violently, and one of the smugglers started screaming at us to get away. It was the voice of a man who had already seen something impossible before we got there. We boarded from port side. One of the men had blood on his eyebrow. Another was holding a fillet knife. There were wet crates, unmarked fuel cans, and the smell of gasoline, old fish, and metal. Our coxswain put them on the deck and called for cuffs. I kept the light on the water. I expected to see a body, a hand, clothing floating. I saw nothing. What I did see was the net. It wasn't a normal fishing net. The mesh was fine, reinforced with cable and small lead weights. It had been torn open from the inside. There was clear mucus stuck to the knots and a saline smell different from the sea, cleaner and stronger. When I lifted it with the toe of my boot, one of the men told me not to touch it. He said it in fear. I asked him what they had hauled up. He did not answer. The youngest one, shaking so badly he could barely stay face down on the deck, muttered something that followed me for years. They weren't going to sell it whole. I thought he meant some protected species, a rare shark, a seal pup, something that still fit inside the known world. I took the net from him and saw, among the threads, something short and curved, the color of wet bone. It was not a fishhook. It was not a human nail. I slipped it into the evidence bag without saying anything. We searched the vessel. No firearm, no papers. Under a tarp, there was a plastic cooler full of melted ice and blood mixed with seawater. Too little for a fishing haul. Too much to ignore. There were also deep marks along the gunnel, 4 parallel grooves, as if something had tried to hold onto the hull while it was moving. Our coxswain wanted to widen the surface search, but the fog thickened and the current started pulling us toward Bad Rock. We had to tow the boat and get the men out of there. I remember looking back the whole way, expecting to see something following us in the wake. Nothing came out of the water. At the dock, we turned them over to the county police and wrote up the basics. Unlit vessel, resistance, smuggled cargo pending identification, shot fired in response to a threat under low visibility conditions, possible person overboard, body not recovered. On paper, it was clean. I had been there. I went to the gear room, cleared my weapon, and stood alone for a few minutes, long enough to notice my hands were shaking. Not because I had fired. They were shaking because of the sound that came after the shot, because I could not find an honest way to fit that sound into a human throat, and because when I closed my eyes, I did not see an attacker. I saw straining arms trying to pull something trapped free. Around 4 in the morning, I had to check the evidence bag before turning it in. I unzipped it, took out the curved fragment caught in the net, and held it under the light. It was a little smaller than my thumbnail, ivory white, semi-translucent, sharpened at one end. Cartilage, I told myself, but at the base there was a reddish film, and stuck to it, a small scale with a dull shine. I never logged it. I wrapped it in paper, slipped it into the inner pocket of my jacket, and left the building as dawn started to break. I had no professional reason to do it. I only had a physical certainty. If I left it there, someone would see it and ask questions I did not yet have the stomach to face. I drove home with the sunrise, trying to force its way through the fog. On that stretch of coast, day does not arrive all at once. First, the air lightens, and then things appear. I had no idea what I would find hours later on the shore. If I had, I might have kept driving and never stopped. I slept less than an hour. I stayed dressed on top of the bed as if they might call me back to the dock, but the phone never rang. I only heard the wind shift and the waves striking closer to the house than usual. When I went down to the beach, the tide was still high. The fog was pale and low. There were branches in the sand, seaweed, a broken crate, and brown storm foam. I saw him when I was about 10 yards away. At first I thought it was a young seal tangled in kelp. Then I saw an arm, not a flipper. A small arm with a 5-fingered hand joined by a thin webbing. My thermos fell from my hand. I did not run. I stood still. The creature was breathing, not through its chest, but through slits on either side of its neck that opened and closed with difficulty. There was mud on its face, dried blood at its temple, and net marks around its torso. I crouched down without touching him. He was a little over 2 feet long from his head to the end of his tail. Because, yes, he had a tail. Not deformed legs, not a sick human body, but a compact tail covered in blue-gray scales. This was not a fantasy. He was injured, shivering, and smelled like deep water and fresh blood. Then he opened his eyes. That ended any attempt to see him as an animal, not because they looked human, not entirely. They were larger and darker, with an inner membrane that flicked across when a gust of wind blew sand at his face. But there was consciousness there. Pain, fear, and something worse. He was looking for someone. He pushed himself up a few inches and made a weak sound, half click and half broken whistle. He turned his head toward the water, then toward me, then back toward the water, as if he expected to see the same figure I had knocked away hours before rise from the sea. I did not understand everything in that instant, but I understood enough. The net, the marks on the boat, The strength in those arms, the sound after my shot, and now this child showing clear signs of having been captured. What I had probably done was not fire at a threat. It was worse. I had shot something that was trying to get its child back. I had to sit down on a rock because my legs gave out. I stared at the water, expecting something to surface. I even thought that big thing I had seen fall from the side of the boat would come out and finish me right there. Nothing appeared. Just gulls and the noise of the tide. The creature moved again. He tried to drag himself toward a pool between the rocks, but he had no strength. The wound at his temple was not the worst of it. Along his side, under his left arm, he had a deep cut where the net or the hull had torn him open. If I left him there, cold or birds would do the rest. If I called anyone, they would take him. Then would come questions about the night before and about the evidence I had not turned in. The logical thing was to report it. The right thing was to call for support, cordon off the area, and hand him over to whoever should deal with it. But while I was thinking all that, he looked at me again. I do not know whether he understood that I was dangerous or if he simply no longer had the strength to tell the difference. What I saw in those eyes was not understanding. It was absolute dependence, and that kind of look turns a decision into a sentence. I took off my jacket, spread it over the sand, and very slowly lifted him. He weighed less than he should have. He was cold but not frozen. When I touched him, I felt smooth skin in some places and roughness where the scales began. He shuddered, made a sharp little sound, and clamped that webbed hand around my wrist, not to hurt me, just to hold on. I carried him to the house against my chest, glancing back toward the water every few steps, sure something was going to come out and claim him before I reached the stairs. No one came. When I shut the door behind me, I'd already made the worst decision of my life. I still did not know how long I would hide him or how I was going to keep him alive. I only knew two things. If I spoke, he would stop being a victim and become evidence, and if I stayed silent, I would have to carry forever the real reason I was saving him. I brought him in through the back door and went straight down to the basement because it was the only place in the house where nobody could see him from the road. Years earlier, the previous owner had tried to install a hydrotherapy tub beside the workshop and abandoned the job halfway through. What was left was a rectangular concrete basin, old pipes, and a useless drain. I had never used it. That morning it became the only thing I had. I laid him first in the laundry tub, filling it with cold water and coarse salt while I worked on something better. It did not help. The slits in his neck opened too fast. The skin on his torso started to lose its shine. He tried to push himself up, slipped, and hit the edge with a hard sound that chilled me. I could not keep him there. I hauled out bags of salt, buckets, and a small pump. I scrubbed the basin, turned on the tap, mixed in salt until the water stopped smelling like pipes and started to smell a little like the dock. It was not seawater, but when I finally lowered him in, the change was immediate. The slits at his neck slowed. His body stopped trembling. He sank to the bottom and went still. I thought he had died. I knelt at the edge with my breath locked in my throat. A few seconds passed, then he opened his eyes underwater. He did not come up for air. He just stared at me from the bottom, perfectly still, as if deciding whether I was the same thing as the net or something different. I went upstairs for a first aid kit and a flashlight. I cleaned the wound on his temple with cleaner water and flushed the cut in his side with a very diluted solution because I was afraid any human antiseptic would poison him. Every time I got close, he showed me his teeth. After a few minutes, he stopped trying to threaten me. I found more marks under the grime, abrasions around his chest as if he'd been cinched tight inside a net, a dark bruise at the base of his tail, small cuts on his webbed fingers. Everything matched the boat and the struggle I had lit up for 1 second before I pulled the trigger. By mid-morning, my work phone rang. I did not answer. Then a message came in from my coxswain asking if I could come by and expand the report. I turned the phone off and left it face down on the kitchen counter. I was already deciding, even if I still could not say it out loud. I brought him fish from the freezer. He did not touch any of it until I stopped looking at him directly. I waited behind the boiler. It took him almost 20 minutes to move. First, he smelled the water around the food. Then, he took a sardine in his hands and held it for a moment as if he recognized its shape. Only then did he bite into it. When I finished covering the basement windows, I went back and sat beside the edge. He had moved up into the shallower end and was resting with half his torso out of the water. For the first time, I could really see him. His skull was rounder than a human child's. His ears were almost flat to his head. His nose was barely defined. A line of tiny scales ran from his collarbone up behind his jaw. He looked built for two worlds and at home in neither. I do not know how long I watched him before I realized he was studying me too. Every time I moved a hand, his eyes followed the gesture. When I spoke, very softly, he tilted his head. "Thomas," I said, touching my chest. He did not respond, but he did not look away. I tried again. "Thomas." Then he made a short clicking sound and dropped his gaze to my hand. It was not language, not yet, but it was not noise either. There was intention in it. I spent the afternoon fixing up the basin, then went into town for sea salt, ice, a thermometer, hoses, and a tarp. I lied at the hardware store and said I was finally going to restore the basement. The lie came too easily. By nightfall, when I went back downstairs, I found him awake and alert. He no longer looked like he was hovering at the edge of death. I left a dim lamp in the corner and sat on the floor with my back against the wall. I did not trust myself to sleep far from him. I did not trust him to stay alive if I left him alone. That was when he came closer for the first time. Not quickly, not affectionately. He moved out of the shadows until he was within arm's reach of the edge. He lifted one hand out of the water and placed it on the concrete right in front of my boot. The webbing between his fingers was torn. Without thinking, I slowly held out my hand. He could have bitten me. He could have recoiled. He did neither. He let me brush my fingers lightly across his knuckles. He was as cold as deep water. "Noah," I said. I don't know why I chose that name. Maybe because I needed to call him something that did not sound like evidence or sin. Maybe because part of me already understood that what the sea had left on my shore was not proof. It was a child torn away from something I had destroyed. When I said the name again, he drew his hand back, but he did not leave. He stayed there in the damp shadows of the basement, staring at me, breathing more and more slowly, while I began to understand a truth that took me years to say all the way through. I did not hide him only to protect him from the world. I hid him to delay the day I would have to admit whose child I had really saved him from. For the first few weeks, I did not live in my house like a man. I lived like someone trying to hold together a wet, fragile lie without leaving a trace. I slept on the basement couch, went out only when necessary, and started measuring the days by how many bags of salt I hauled home and how much Noah could keep down without bringing it back up. I took medical leave, claiming post-operation stress. Nobody pushed too hard. In the Coast Guard, we were used to men who, after one bad night, needed a few days away from the water. What they did not know was that I was still surrounded by water. The makeshift basin was not enough. The concrete lost temperature too fast and the drain made too much noise. In 3 nights, I tore out half a basement wall, redid pipes, installed insulation, a used filter, and a quieter pump. Upstairs, the house smelled like paint and damp wood. Downstairs, it began to smell like the sea. Noah improved fast. The cut along his side closed without infection. The swelling at his temple went down in 4 days. Within a week, he no longer stayed on the bottom watching me as if I were a trap. He swam from one end to the other, slapped the surface if I was slow with the food, and reacted to my voice before he even saw me coming down the stairs. I learned what he would accept and what he would not. Sardines, yes. Herring, yes. Salmon, sometimes. Squid, never. If he did not like something, he would hold it between his fingers, stare straight at me, and let it sink. I also learned he needed more room than I could give him. When he got agitated, his tail smacked the walls. I expanded the basin until it became a decent underground pool. My savings were gone in less than 6 months. I sold my boat and told people I no longer had time to fish. I resigned from the service for good a year later. Officially, it was burnout. The truth was simpler. I could not keep swearing to protect a coastline while hiding in my basement, a truth that could crack the whole country open. Noah was growing, was autism. His forehead grew leaner, his shoulders widened, His tail got stronger, color blooming along the edges in a blue-gray that sometimes looked almost silver. When he was in a good mood, he would spin full circles underwater and finish by splashing me on purpose. He also started to understand me. He could not form human words, but he recognized patterns. His name first, then simple commands: wait, no, come, easy. Later, gestures. Tapping my chest meant Thomas, pointing at the stairs meant upstairs. 2 fingers pressed to my lips meant quiet. If he heard a car brake or voices too close to the house, he disappeared under the deepest part of the pool in less than a second. One night in February, the power went out across the whole area. I went downstairs with a flashlight, worried the filter motor would stop. I found Noah frozen in the darkness, only his eyes above the water. When I shined the beam toward him, he flinched as if he expected it to strike him. He was not afraid of the dark. He was afraid of the sudden flash and the sharp crack that sometimes followed. I turned the light off, sat on the floor, and talked until he stopped trembling. That was when I understood the gunshot did not live only in me. After that, I started playing music when I worked downstairs. He responded better to strings than to anything else. If I put on cello, he would rise to the surface and float there nearly motionless, listening. That was the worst thing that happened to me. I started to love him in a way that left me with no moral way out, not as an obligation, not as penance. I loved him in the exact way a man comes to love someone whose life depends on him. And every time that tenderness appeared, the other truth came with it. All of this existed because one night I fired before I understood. Sometimes at dawn, I would find him staring at the little high basement window. From there, he could not see the whole ocean, just a pale band of sky, and on clear days, a glimmer of water in the distance. Noah would stay perfectly still, looking at it. He never asked to leave. Not yet. But long before he knew how to ask for anything, I already knew that one day the sea would remember us. The first real change was not physical. It was behavioral. Up to then, Noah had accepted the basement the way you accept an entire world when you know no other. He swam, ate, listened to music, slept long hours in the deepest end. And when I came downstairs, he almost always surfaced before I put a foot on the last step. But in the winter of 2016, he started hearing things I could not hear. I don't know a better way to say it. Sometimes he would leave his food untouched and go completely still, head cocked, staring toward the pipes in the north wall, the one facing the sea. Other times he would shoot up from the bottom, lift half his body out of the water, and make a sequence of very low clicks and whistles, not aimed at me, but at something beyond the concrete, as if he were trying to answer a voice coming from very far away. The first time, I thought he was reacting to the wind. On this coast, the air pushes sound through every crack: branches, tin, gravel skittering, buoys in the harbor. But Noah was not reacting to general noise. He was reacting to particular nights, to changes in the tide, to certain hours before dawn when the air smelled more strongly of kelp and the house gave the slightest tremor, as if the surf were a few yards closer than usual. I started writing down dates, times, barometric pressure, tide levels. I had not kept a service notebook in years, but the habit was still in me. A pattern showed up fast. Noah became most agitated on spring tides, under a new moon with low fog. The exact combination from the night I found him. I still did not talk to him about the sea more than necessary. I taught him useful words, objects, colors, parts of the house, small things. Not because I believed he could stay with me forever, but because if I did not think about the ending, the present stayed bearable. That was the cowardice I built almost our entire life on. But Noah was growing too fast for my cowardice. When he straightened up in the water, he came to my chest. His shoulders had broadened, the line of his neck had sharpened, and the slits along the sides opened with a steady rhythm that no longer suggested the vulnerability of a young thing, but the controlled breathing of something made for long depths. His hands were stronger, too. If he wanted to snatch a bucket from me or drag a floating cover to the bottom, he did it without effort. He never hurt me on purpose, but more than once, a sudden movement from him was enough to remind me I was living with a species I did not fully understand. One afternoon, I brought down an old radio because cell service kept failing during storms. I left it on while I checked the filter, and the static shifted a second before the marine weather report came through. Noah surfaced immediately, startled, and hit the water with his tail so hard he drenched my face. It was not the human voice that affected him, it was the frequency beforehand, that muffled crackle like a long transmission traveling through water and fog. I turned the radio off, and it took him almost an hour to calm down. After that, he started spending more time under the high basement window. He could not see much from there, just a corner of sky, the line of the dunes, and sometimes a pale reflection of the water when the day cleared. Noah would stay beneath that rectangle of light for long stretches, so still it seemed he was listening through the wall and the ground. Then the drawing started. Years earlier, I had given him a plastic tablet and a couple of wax pencils for children, more out of curiosity than hope. At first, he made only lines, blotches, formless circles. In 2016, he began drawing the same thing over and over. A long curve I recognized as the coast. Then rocks. Then a dark mass below the waterline. And several times, 3 tall figures on the shore of a blurry drawing he never managed to finish without snapping the tip of the pencil. I did not know whether he was remembering or imagining. That ignorance was my first real punishment. Because if Noah was remembering, then he had never been as safe with me as I wanted to believe. And if he was imagining, it meant something in his body was calling him back to a world I could not replace with music, food, and concrete. In August, I stepped onto the back porch at dawn and found a silver fish lying on the boards, fresh. No gull marks, no raccoon bites. I picked it up with a shovel and threw it out. The next morning there were 2. The third day, none. I convinced myself it had to be birds or some strange neighbor. I did not want another explanation until I saw the tracks. They were not exactly tracks. They were wet marks across the gravel, parallel and broken, as if something heavy had moved in jerks from the edge of the tide line to the base of the bluff and back into the water before dawn. No crushed plants, no disturbed mud like a person would leave. Just a shining trace that smelled more of iodine than open sea. I followed it with my eyes to where the rocks disappeared into the fog and stood still too long. With that sensation you get in the service when you realize someone has observed your position before you ever knew they were there. I went down to the basement with my pulse racing. Noah was already waiting at the surface, looking not at the stairs but directly at me, as if he knew what I had just seen. He raised one hand, pointed upward, and then toward the north wall. Then he touched his chest with his fingers and made a string of clicks so low I could barely hear them. "Noah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "No." He did not understand the word, or he understood it and chose to ignore it. He sank, did a full turn through the pool, and surfaced again closer to the edge, breathing fast, eyes fixed on the window. It was no longer the old fear. It was not the reaction of an injured child. It was recognition. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in the kitchen with the unloaded shotgun on the table and the radio turned off, listening to the house groan in the fog. I thought about the bullet, the net, the figure that had fallen from the hull, everything I had managed to bury between 4 walls. And for the first time, I accepted an idea I had spent years circling without naming. The ocean had not lost Noah. It had just taken a long time to track him to my door. In September 2017, I made a mistake I had spent years both avoiding and expecting. I brought down from the garage loft the gray box where I had stored everything connected to the 2009 operation. I had not opened it before because I knew there were no documents inside. There was a version of myself in there that still needed to believe he had acted correctly. The box still smelled like damp oil and old paper. Inside were my service notebook, a copy of the original report, a laminated chart of the area, printed photos of the seized boat, and a clear bag holding objects that never should have left the chain of evidence. Among them were the curved fragment I had taken from the net before dawn and the dull scale stuck to a dried smear of blood. I carried it all up to the kitchen. I did not go down to the basement for almost an hour. Noah slapped the surface twice to call for me, a habit he had when he wanted food or noticed I had been gone too long. I did not answer. I poured coffee, sat under the yellow kitchen light, and opened the report. The words were still there. Clean, cold, cowardly. Large figure adjacent to suspicious vessel. Potential threat. Defensive shot discharged by Officer Thomas Hale. Read 8 years later, it sounded like the report of a calm man. I remembered perfectly well that I was not calm. I remembered the fog sticking to my face, the overlapping shouts, the flashlight bouncing off the water, and beneath all of that, the sense that something in that scene did not fit an ordinary ambush. Then I went to the photos. The first showed the boat already being towed at the dock. The second, the starboard rail with the 4 parallel grooves I had seen that night. The third made me set my coffee down before I knocked it over. In the image, the net was half hauled over the side, stretched outward, and right below the edge, almost erased by flash and water, there was something small caught in the mesh. I enlarged the picture in my mind before I let myself accept what I was looking at. It was not a bundle of cargo. It was not a cooler, not a tarp, not fish. It was a small hand. I had to plant both palms on the table to keep from standing up. The hand was on the outside of the net, not inside the boat. The fingers looked as if they were clinging to the mesh from below, as if something or someone had been trying to pull the child free into the water or return the child to the water in the middle of that maneuver. That meant the large figure I had seen climbing up was not attacking the vessel to get on board. It was pulling at the net. I walked through the whole sequence again, men shouting, weight hanging outside, the gunwale scarred, the figure rising not toward us but toward whatever hung off the side. For years I had told myself I reacted to a threat. The truth, or at least the closest thing to the truth I deserved to say, was different. I had fired at a father or a mother at the exact moment it was trying to get its child back. I looked down at the curved fragment wrapped in paper. I unfolded it more carefully than I had the first time. Under the kitchen light, it looked neither like cartilage nor human bone. It was a keratinous piece, hard and translucent, more like a small defensive spine or the broken tip of a crest. The scale stuck to the edge still held that dull sheen no local species could explain. All that time I had kept physical proof of what I had done inside my own house. Then I remembered something else. A sentence, not from the report, but from the youngest smuggler, the one trembling with his face pressed to the deck. They weren't going to sell it whole. In 2009, I heard it the way you hear a scared idiot saying whatever comes into his head to buy time. In 2017, with the photo in front of me and Noah breathing in the basement under my feet, the phrase showed its real meaning. Those men had not stumbled across something in the sea. They had captured it. And if they were willing to sell it in pieces, that meant there were already buyers, stories, prior rumors. It was not the first encounter, just the first one for me. I felt nauseous. I went down to the basement with the photograph in my hand, and guilt pounding behind my eyes like a fever. Noah was under the window, motionless, waiting. When I stepped to the edge of the pool, he rose slowly and rested both forearms on the concrete. He was no longer a child. His face had grown longer, his shoulders broad, and he held my gaze in that way that forced me to remember every minute that he understood far more than I pretended. I did not show him the photo, not yet, but he knew something had changed. He brought one hand toward the edge of the paper, smelled the air above it, and made a short, low sound I had never heard from him before. It was not fear. It was recognition. And in that instant, I understood that my silence was no longer protecting Noah from the truth. It was only protecting me from the moment I would have to see that truth reflected in his eyes. It did not take long. When a lie lives in a house for too many years, it eventually learns to move on its own. 2 days after I opened the garage box, I went down to the basement with Fish and every intention of behaving as if nothing had changed. Noah did not touch the food. He stayed near the edge, perfectly still, watching me with the hard focus he used to show only when he heard something from the sea beyond the wall. He was no longer a child. He had grown inside my guilt. That night, I took the box up to the study to hide it better. I locked the photos in a drawer, went to bed without dinner, and was woken around 3 by a heavy thud, then another, then silence. The basement door was open. I always left it shut with the inside latch fastened. That night it hung splintered from the wood. I went down without turning on the light and saw him. Noah was out of the pool. He had left a trail of water all the way to the study. He had dragged himself farther than I thought possible. The edges of his tail were red, his forearms scraped raw, and still he had made it to the desk with the drawer pulled open. The photographs were on the floor. He turned toward me with one of them stuck to his wet palm, the one of the net, the one with the small hand caught in the strands. "Noah," I said, and the second I said his name, I knew it was too late. He made no sound. He just lifted the photo a little higher, pointed at the net, then at his own chest, then at me. It was a question turned accusation, him, that night, and me. I moved closer slowly. Noah jerked backward, dragging his tail across the floorboards. He had never pulled away from me like that before. I could have lied again, said anything, but there comes a point when lying stops protecting and becomes just another form of harm. "Yes," I said, just that one word, because anything longer would have sounded like an excuse. Noah looked at the photo, then back at me. The slits in his neck were opening too fast. He made a harsh clicking sound and thrust the image toward me again, demanding more. "I was there," I said. "On the boat. I fired." The last word came out broken. Noah dropped the photograph and it stuck to the wet floor. Then he struck the boards with his open hand, once, twice, 3 times, as if he needed the whole house to hear what had just happened. "I didn't know what you were," I went on. "I didn't know what the one there was. I thought it was attacking." Noah let out a sound so sharp it made me cover one ear. It was not an animal cry, it was rejection. He pushed himself up on both arms and looked at me in a way I had never seen before. There was no fear in it. There was understanding, and understanding hurt more. "I found you at dawn," I said. "You were hurt. I brought you inside. I took care of you." All of that was true. I tried to come closer. Bad decision. Noah slammed the floor with his tail and knocked a chair into the wall. Wood exploded. Then he touched his chest, lifted the hand above his head, and dropped it to the side. A new gesture. It needed no translation. Someone falls into the water. Someone does not come back. I lowered my head. "I don't know if it died that night," I lied one last time, and I knew it was a lie the instant I said it. Noah picked the photo up from the floor, looked at it for a few seconds, and threw it at my feet. Then he pointed at the pool, pointed at the high window, and finally touched my chest with 2 curved fingers before yanking his hand back as if he had been burned. For years, that gesture had meant Thomas. That night, it meant something else. You. I carried him back to the water because outside it, he was already beginning to shake. And this time, he let me do it with a stiffness that made me feel not like a father, but like a jailer. The second his body hit the pool, he withdrew to the bottom and stayed there, looking up at me through the water. I sat beside the edge until dawn. When the first light came through the high window, Noah surfaced only once. He did not come near me. He looked upward and answered something outside with a long string of clicks and low notes, firmer than any sound I had ever heard from him before. He was no longer calling blindly. Now he knew exactly why he had to. The storm hit 4 nights after Noah found the photograph. It was not one of those long, weary Pacific rains, but a night of low pressure, short wind, and swollen sea, as if the whole coast were breathing faster than normal. He had been restless since the afternoon. He did not eat. He did not want music. He circled the deep end of the pool in slow loops and only surfaced to listen. By then I knew that kind of silence. It was not waiting. It was recognition. He knew something was coming, and for the first time since I found him, he did not seem afraid of it. Around 10, the power went out. The whole house groaned when the wind shifted direction. Upstairs, the living room windows rattled. Downstairs, the filter fell silent and the pool turned into a black slab. I switched on the flashlight and Noah dove immediately, but not because he feared the light. He dropped the way someone takes position. Then I heard the first sound. It came from outside, from the bluff side. It was not singing, not exactly. It was a long, low note, held just long enough to make the glass in the high basement window tremble. When it ended, the house went so quiet, I could hear water dripping from a pipe in the back wall. Noah surged to the surface and answered. I had never heard him like that. The sound came out deeper, cleaner, with a structure that no longer sounded like a young creature trying to imitate something distant, but like the full voice of someone who had finally found an answer. The reply from outside came almost immediately, closer this time. I went up to the back porch with the unloaded shotgun in one hand and the flashlight in the other. Rain hit me sideways. From there I could barely make out the grassy slope, the black rocks, and the line of foam at the foot of the property. I swung the light toward the water. I saw two figures. They were not on the shore, but just where the last line of short waves was breaking, half submerged, too upright to be seals, too still to be people. The beam did not reach their faces, but it caught the high shoulders, the wet shine of their skin, and the way they sank under the foam without splashing the way a human body would. I shut the light off and stepped back, not out of cowardice, out of clarity. For 16 years I had kept one tiny piece of hope alive inside me, one miserable shard insisting that maybe all of this could still stay contained, that if I did not ask questions, did not speak, kept the basement sealed and the routine intact, the sea would eventually forget. Seeing them there, less than 50 yards from my house, killed that illusion for good. I went back down to the basement. Noah was pressed beneath the high window, his torso out of the water, listening. When I came in, he turned toward me, and for the first time I saw no resentment in his face, no affection, no fear. I saw decision. "Noah," I said. He pointed upward. "I know." Then he touched his chest, pointed at the north wall, and opened his hand outward. A simple gesture. Me. Outside. I shook my head before I even thought. "No." He repeated the gesture. Then he pointed at the pool, then at the concrete around it, then at the door. He needed no translation anymore. He was showing me what I had refused to say. For him, this had stopped being a refuge. It was a cell. I felt a shame so clean, I almost welcomed the pain, because it was the first honest emotion I had felt since he found the photograph. Everything else had been reflex, defend, hide, delay. That night there was nothing left to delay. From upstairs came another impact of water against the house, then the sound of something heavy sliding across the porch boards. I ran up. I saw no one. I only found the coal bucket knocked over, and beside the door, 3 wet parallel marks on the wood. Not deep scratches, just pressure and salt, as if a large hand had rested there just long enough to make one thing clear. It could have come farther. I stood looking at them in the rain until I accepted the obvious. They were not trying to break in. They were waiting. I went back to the kitchen, took the shed keys and the key to the metal cabinet where I kept the few service things I had not sold after I retired. I found the cuffs, the backup flashlight, a thermal blanket, rope, the old yellow rain slicker, and at the back, my unloaded service pistol. I held it in my hand for a few seconds. I did not need it to defend the house. I needed it to lie to myself again. I left it where it was. Then, I went down to the basement and opened the storage chest where, all those years, I had kept the gray box from the operation and the rest of the evidence I never turned in. I put the photo, the curved fragment, the dried scale, and a copy of the report into a dry bag. If that night ended badly, I was not going to let another man write the story for me. Noah was still waiting at the surface. He watched me put on the rain slicker and understood before I said it. "We're going down," I murmured, "but only once. And my way, if I still have any right to that." He did not come closer right away. He circled slowly under the water, then returned to the edge, close enough for me to see the old scar along his side, that pale line that had followed me for half my life. He lifted one hand, hesitated, and set it on the concrete between us. It was not forgiveness. It was not goodbye. It was consent. Outside, in the middle of wind and rain, another voice answered from the water. Closer now, less patient. I looked at the stairs, the door, the pool, the high window that for years had let in nothing but a strip of sky, and I understood that if I kept Noah there 1 hour longer, I would no longer be able to call what I had done love. So I turned off the light, took the dry bag, and told him the only useful truth I had left. It's time. We went down the back path, with the rain hitting us head on. I carried the dry bag slung across my chest and kept the flashlight off. Noah moved beside me where the terrain allowed it, and when the slope narrowed between rock and mud, He slid ahead of me with an ease that always reminded me his body belonged to another world. Water ran over his shoulders and along the line of his scales as if it were claiming him before we even reached the shore. The beach was barely a strip of dark gravel between the bluff and the foam. The sea surged and retreated with restrained violence, as if the storm had not decided to break yet. I did not switch on the light. I did not need to. They were already there. First, I saw two upright silhouettes in the low waves, then a third, farther out, almost motionless, too tall to be mistaken for anything else. When it moved closer, I understood it was not the largest by size, but by presence. I had spent years imagining the moment something from the ocean would come collect the debt, and still nothing prepared me for the exact way that being looked at me. Not with blind fury, not with hunger. It looked at me the way a witness looks when it finally recognizes the precise man it has spent half a lifetime searching for. Noah stopped a few yards from the water. He made a short sequence of clicks and low notes. The two nearer figures answered at once, but the third waited a few seconds longer. When it finally did, the sound cut through the wind and vibrated in my chest. Noah took one step forward, then another. Then, the third figure came far enough out of the breaking water for me to see its side. It had a sunken scar beneath the shoulder, old, whitish, irregular, like the mark left by a ripped-out harpoon or a wound that had healed badly. It was not the creature I had shot in 2009. That one had fallen into the water in front of me with the sound of a defeated body. This one had survived something else. Years. Searching. Loss. And yet the moment Noah saw it, something in him changed completely. It was not fear. It was not simple recognition. It was that physical animal certainty with which a child recognizes something his body knew before his memory did. He launched himself into the water. Everything happened very fast, and at the same time, it all felt slow. The two side figures moved toward him, but they were not the first to touch him. The third was. It caught him at the back of the neck and across the spine, pressed its forehead to his, and made a lower sound, one that broke in the middle, and even I understood it as grief. Noah answered by clutching at its shoulders. There was nothing in the world that could compete with that. No human excuse, no 16 years of care, no routine we had built together in the basement. I stood where I was, the water hitting my boots, watching the most just and most unbearable scene of my life. One of the other adults turned toward me. It took one step out of the water, then another. In the rain, I could see its face more clearly. Large eyes, narrow jaw, smooth skin pulled taut over a structure almost human and still wholly alien. At the base of its neck, the slits opened and closed calmly. It did not need to bare its teeth or rise any taller for me to know that if it wanted to, it could kill me right there. "Noah," I said, not to ask for help, only because I did not know how else to speak to the sea. He turned. He was still held by the third figure, the parent who had survived. He looked at me with an expression that no longer belonged to the boy in the basement. He had made his decision before we ever came down to the beach. Maybe he made it the moment he found the photograph. Maybe he had been making it for years while I refused to see it. I opened the dry bag and took out the photograph, the scale, and the curved fragment. Rain started soaking the paper at once. I stepped forward until the water covered half my boot and raised the photograph in both hands. "I did it," I said, though the wind stole half my voice. I fired. The figure in front of me made a short, hard sound. Behind it, the third one lifted its head slowly. Noah watched me without looking away. "I didn't know what I was seeing," I went on. "That is true, but it doesn't change what I did." I took another step. Freezing water flooded my ankle. I raised the unloaded pistol I had slipped into the bag at the last second, not as a weapon, but as proof, and let it fall onto the rocks between us. Then, I dropped the photo and the rest. The tide took them immediately. "I didn't save him out of nobility," I said. "At first I hid him because I couldn't stand knowing who I was if I gave him up. After that, I loved him. That's true too. Both things are true." Noah pulled away from the adult holding him and came forward alone until he stood between them and me. I had never seen him stand so straight. The water hit him at the waist, and still he looked steadier than any of us. The aggressive figure tried to move around him. Noah snapped out a dry, cutting sound and stopped it. I understood without translation. He would not allow them to touch me. The third figure, the one who had gotten its child back, held my gaze for several seconds. Then it dipped its head very slightly toward Noah, as if yielding the choice to him. That gesture destroyed me more than any threat could have, because it confirmed the one thing I did not deserve to receive. The judgment did not belong to me, or even to them. It belonged to Noah. He turned his face toward me, touched his chest, pointed to the ocean, pointed to me, and finally brought 2 fingers to the old scar on his side. I understood all of it. I was the wound. The ocean was his home, and neither could be erased. Noah was all I managed to say. He came close once more, close enough to rest his hand on my forearm, exactly where he had gripped me the morning I picked him up off the sand. The pressure was brief. Then he pulled away, turned toward his own kind, and did not look back again. The 3 of them moved into the water with a speed that did not look like movement so much as restoration. For a few seconds, I could still make out Noah's head between the rain and the foam. Then, there was only the sea. I wanted to move forward, not to stop him, just out of some absurd reflex, the last remnant of the life I had built around him. A stronger wave hit my legs and forced me to stay still. I remained there a long time, with the water rising and falling over the stones, until the tide carried the pistol out to sea, and I understood that the night had ended without absolving me. Noah was gone. His people had left me alive. And those 2 things together were a far more exact punishment than death. I never went back into the water after that night. I climbed to the house soaked through, boots full of gravel, hands empty, and for the first time in 16 years, the basement waited for me without him. I went down before dawn out of habit, turned on the light and saw the pool, motionless, black, too orderly. Without Noah, the place looked like what it had always been to anyone but me. Concrete, pipes, dampness, an enclosure built with diseased patience. On the windowsill, wet but intact, I found one of the wax pencils he used for his drawings of coastlines and tides. I held it like an idiot, because the body reaches for objects when it can no longer touch the person. I did not sleep. I sat in the kitchen until morning light came, then stepped out onto the back porch. The bullet was there, the one from 2009. I recognized it even flattened, the tip crushed by salt and stone. I had seen it leave my gun. I had heard it enter something living. And now it lay on the wet boards, clean of mud, set almost in the same spot where the first one had appeared days earlier. Beside it, they had left something else, a blue piece of plastic with one end chewed. It was part of the floating ring I used when Noah was still too small to hold himself up in the deep end of the pool. I had not seen that piece in years, yet there it was, next to the bullet, like a sentence made of 2 objects. We know what you did. We know what he was to you. Neither one erases the other. I went down on my knees on the porch boards and understood what my punishment was. They had not forgiven me. They had understood me. And that was worse. For a long time, I thought justice would have meant being dragged under that night, a simple death, proportional. But no. The exact punishment was to leave me here, inside the house I had turned into a refuge and a cage at the same time, with every memory intact and not a single way to undo the beginning of any of it. I went down to the basement again and looked at everything as if it belonged to another man. The salt buckets, the tools, the growth marks on the wall, the broken chair from the night he found the photograph. I opened the waterproof box with his drawings. Coasts, rocks, waves, always 3 figures on the shore. Maybe he had spent years trying to show me something I only understood when it was too late. I set up the camera and started recording. Not out of courage, out of exhaustion, because there was nothing left to protect now except the truth. And the truth, if you keep it too long, rots like everything else. This is the only clean thing I can say. I fired the shot that tore Noah away from his life. Then I hit him. At first out of fear, then out of guilt, and much later out of love. All 3 things lived inside me all these years, and anyone listening to this, hoping for a simple version, will hate me for the same reason I hate myself, because the love was real. Caring for him was real. So was the violence the whole life was built on. We like to think evil arrives with clear intent, with an easy cruelty you can point to and name. It does not work that way. Sometimes it starts with a 1-second decision, a decision that uniform, fear, and habit make feel reasonable. Then comes the consequence. Then the silence. Then a routine so tender it almost looks like redemption. And one day you realize you redeemed nothing. You just managed the original harm for years. I don't know where Noah is now. I want to believe he is with his own kind. I want to believe that, besides my gunshot, he will remember the music, the high window, and the times he listened to me speak even when neither of us had words for what mattered. But if he ever comes back, I do not think it will be for me. That is why I am speaking now. Because the ocean left me alive, and living was the sentence. If a life begins in an unforgivable act, and somewhere inside that life the love becomes real, does that love save anything at all? Or does it only make it harder to look straight at the original harm?